to all of you who are joining us on the line, and welcome as well to our guest, friend and colleague, Vicky Pryce. This British Chambers of Commerce webinar will look at lockdown, restart and recovery. I want to thank our friends at Moneycorp, our partners in the Chamber Foreign Exchange Scheme, for supporting today's event. And most of all, as I said, I do want to welcome Vicky Pryce, who is a dear friend and long-standing advisor to the BCC, but even more importantly, one of the most foremost economists in the UK and a former head of the Government Economic Service. Today, Vicky and I will be having a discussion on how the coronavirus crisis has impacted business and the economy. We're going to focus over the course of the discussion on three themes. First, the impact so far. Second, what happens over the next few months. And then finally, take a look to the future, and I will invite Vicky to gaze into her crystal ball a little bit and see what she thinks may happen as we exit from this most sharp and difficult economic crisis. So Vicky and I are going to trade questions for a bit this morning, and we'll also be monitoring questions coming in from our webinar audience from Chambers of Commerce, both here in the UK and all across the world. And we'll do our best to weave those into this morning's discussion. So let's get underway. My first question to you, Vicky. What impact do you think the lockdown has had on the UK economy and UK business?
Well, it's been very obvious, unfortunately, for all to see. We've had a block, if you like, both on supply, because basically we've asked all sorts of firms to close down or at least wait for a while until they can reopen and stop trading and producing. And we've also stopped demand by closing those places, of course, but also expecting people to stay at home a lot more. And those who can't go to, have to go to work on public transport and so on, have to carry on doing it if they have absolutely no other way of doing their work. But a very large percentage of workers are either working from home or are not really working at all because they're being followed. And there's also been quite a big increase in the number of people who are unemployed, which means that basically demand is also falling. So we've been hit by two things, both a supply shock and a demand shock. And that, of course, has put huge strain on the economy. The expectations are for this quarter, we'll see a decline of perhaps 35%. Already the economy is operating at 30% below where it was on average during 2019. So it is a big shock without any doubt. And we're not alone, of course. That's been happening across the world, which means that whole sections of manufacturing and so on cannot really export their goods because demand has dropped very significantly internationally. So it's one of those shocks which for the moment feels like it's worse than the financial crisis. We were all there at the time. I was working for the government then, and it looks like it's going to be worse even than the Great Depression back in the early 20th century.
Okay, well, now, Vicky, obviously we're seeing that 35% fall in the economy overall, but clearly some sectors are being hit more than others by this. In our work at the British Chambers of Commerce, we're seeing the B2C, business to consumer sector of the economy hit perhaps the hardest. That's the impact we're picking up most so far. And obviously that would be manifest in all of those retail shops that have been closed, all of those businesses that have literally downed tools and said, we're not going back until we have a clear route map to keep our people safe, etc. Which sectors do you see in your economic analysis as being some of the worst affected, those who've been hit the hardest?
Well, hospitality, entertainment, if you look at what's happening generally with sort of pubs and restaurants, but the travel business, of course, which has collapsed. If you look at airlines, quite a lot of them have been grounded and are seeking help from governments, not just here, but everywhere. So we're seeing renationalization taking place in many countries across Europe of some of the main airlines, and others doesn't look like they might be able to come back again. So those have been very significant, but we've seen it across really. We forget that manufacturing is so dependent on exports, so dependent on people being able to go and do the work. And of course, because of social distancing measures, they have generally stopped. Some are talking about sort of thinking about a phased start again to their operations, but there is a serious concerns that various regions are going to be very badly affected because they're so dependent on manufacturing, and that may take quite some time to pick up. It's interesting when you look at other countries again. Italy is desperate to get this manufacturing sector working, even though they had this very draconian rules. The way they're opening up is encouraging, in fact, car production and other manufacturing sectors to start first, because they are aware that without that, their economy will do very badly. Construction has suffered, of course, quite significantly. Again, the rules there have been a little bit confusing. What we're finding now is that there have been better guidelines that the industry is using, and some construction, some building works are beginning to happen. But again, obviously, they're very concerned about how to do it in a way that doesn't endanger the health of people. But as you mentioned, some sectors are doing quite well. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, in IT, I mean, here we are using this extraordinary system, and there are many others. Obviously, demand for all these things have gone up. Public health more generally, and of course, anyone who works in the public sector, where they've been recruiting very large numbers of people. So there is a bit of a them and us situation, if you like. Those who can work from home are doing okay. Those who have depended on the gig economy and doing lots of casual work, many people, of course, have been in that part of the labour market in the last few years. They have been suffering the most.
It feels a bit like we've got an economy in three pieces. A third of the economy that's able to operate more or less as normal because businesses are able to be flexible and don't have to shut down any of their operations. Another third of the economy which is operating with some difficulty and some reduced capacity. And then a final third where quite literally nothing is happening because it's had to shut down entirely. Now, all of that leads us to question what happens, when we come out of the lockdown itself. The Office for Budget Responsibility here in the UK predicted a pretty fast bounce back, what you economists would call a V-shaped recovery rather than anything else. What do you think of that OBR prediction? Do you think that a V-shaped bounce back is likely based on the data that you're seeing?
The OBR figures, which came out revised after the budget. I mean, the budget now, March the 11th, seems such a long time.
It was an eternity ago, wasn't it?
Previous century, basically.
Yeah.
And of course, the Chancellor said to come back with a lot more, almost on a daily basis. And I'd like to ask you, whether you think that's been enough and the response has been good. So the expectation of the OBR, it's not actually an expectation, it's not a forecast. It's based entirely on the assumption that the lockdown eases at the end of this quarter. So we don't have another 3 months. So they're assuming practically full return to work. On that basis, they have quite a substantial recovery, a V-shaped recovery taking place. It does not mean that the government doesn't need to borrow huge amounts more, which it does, and that we're going to have debt, which is considerably higher, and we'll have to live with it for years to come. But nevertheless, we have a recovery, and unemployment, though it rises very significantly to over 10%, then starts coming down. So it doesn't look horrendous. We have a deficit of about possibly 14% of GDP for a bit, and then it starts coming down again. But of course, it may not happen like that at all. The lockdown may ease, but may be very gradual, in which case we're not going to see anything like that happening. We're probably going to see more of a, since you mentioned a V, more of a U. Some people are worried that actually it might be an L. In other words, we drop very substantially and then nothing happens for a while. But I suspect something will happen, because once you drop so fast, even if you have a little bit of an improvement, it's quite a big percentage change that takes place.
So a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recovery. Let me add another one into the mix, if I may. What about a W-shape? I.e. things do bounce back relatively quickly, but because we're still dealing with the consequences of a virus which may reappear at any time, there could be a further lockdown in future and the need to bring back some of the harshest measures that have the biggest impact on the economy. Do you see that as a possibility as well?
I think that's the main fear, that we will have a resurgence of the virus, and then we'll have to have another lockdown. So people are worried about what may happen in the autumn. That's why I don't think, and nobody really believes, that there's going to be a complete easing. In other words, that lockdown sort of finishes. I think there's still going to be measures there to ensure that that doesn't happen, but it is absolutely a possibility. But it's extraordinary when you look at some countries like New Zealand doesn't have any new cases, so no cases it seems anymore,
Let's
and
come
they've
on
opened
to
up, which is extraordinary.
let's come on to those global economies where things have been a little bit more successful. You mentioned New Zealand. You also have the case of South Korea or Taiwan, where they seem to have done a good job with this. Again, countries like Denmark, closer to home, who seem to have had a relatively good response to the crisis. Which countries do you see as the bright spots, and which ones do you see as the black spots so far in this process?
Well, the one you mentioned, of course, have done quite well. There is a debate in the Scandinavian countries about whether the Swedish model is better than perhaps the others, where they kept things open more or less as they were, but keeping social distancing as well. We don't actually know whether we're measuring the right things. In some countries, they're measuring all care homes and private clinics and so on quite well. In others, they don't. So we had data from China that we don't necessarily trust completely, where suddenly the numbers in Wuhan seem to be hugely higher, if not double what they were before, which are now being announced. So we just don't know which ones are good. But the ones that have really succeeded reasonably well are the ones that had a very substantial lockdown very early on. And that also includes, strangely enough, the country I know quite well, which is Greece, which in the interest of preserving some sort of tourist trade at some point, if they could, had a very massive lockdown very early on and have very, very few cases. What I worry about is the extent to which those countries, in order to avoid the W shape that you mentioned, will really open up travel and tourism. And so whether we're going to see this movement of people taking place, or whether they're going to be very, very careful about borders and also trade. Trade is forecast to drop very significantly this quarter. The WTO seems to think that that will fall from anything between 20 and 35% this quarter. And if that is the case, then that seriously undermines the prospects of a global recovery. And we as an open country really depend very heavily on being able to export and trade. And that is a serious concern if it only comes back very slowly. And the world forecasts are for a drop, which is practically unheard of 3% in GDP this year, and a bounce back afterwards, but again, dependent on all those conditions, which are similar to what we've been discussing about the UK.
Thank you, Vicky. I've asked you a few questions. I think it's your turn to fire some back in the opposite direction, so I'll hand over to you.
Well, I hinted, really. I mean, we're all asked to comment on the economy, but of course, what businesses think matters hugely. And the impression I have is that the Chancellor and the Government Department General have been listening to you. Do you think that the government has done enough for businesses? And are you pleased with what's been going on in terms of response?
I think the government has done one thing that is positive and that is hugely important, which is that it is listening continuously and iterating the support that it's put on the table all the time. It's not always the case that governments do that. They put a policy in place and they say, that's it, we're done. We're not going to adjust it at all. But what we've seen over the past 6 weeks is, first of all, an open door and a regular conversation with chambers of commerce, wanting to know what's happening on the ground, and then adjustments to so many of the policies to make sure they're actually having the desired impact. I think there's still some way they could go, and there will be more adjustments that they will probably have to make. But if you look at the 3 core policies for business support in turn, you can see that they've moved on each of them. So on loans, for example, they came out with a scheme, and now following feedback from us and from others, they're probably on their 3rd or 4th iteration of those loans to businesses, including a much faster route announced yesterday for loans to the smallest firms of under £50,000, getting to a process that's more similar to what they have in Germany and Switzerland, where there's 100% government guarantee and very minimal credit checking before loans are put out there. And that's a very important improvement and iteration on it. But of course, that's still a loan. And there are many companies out there right now that do not want to take on debt at all because they do not see where their future revenue streams are coming from. So that raises the question of grants. Now, there are grant schemes in all 4 nations of the UK for smaller businesses, which are helping in a number of areas. Indeed, there's also grant schemes specifically for the retail, hospitality, and leisure sector, which is one of the hardest hit by closures. I suppose one question we have is whether those grant schemes ultimately will have to be extended to provide support to more SMEs in a way that doesn't prevent them from actually accessing it. Because if a huge proportion of businesses are saying to us, I can't take on a loan, they may fail unless they are given some form of additional support, and with it go people's livelihoods and employment. Then there's the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme as it's known formally. And I have to say, I think this is the star piece of the equation so far. Our data suggests that nearly 3/4 of businesses are making some use of it in some way, shape or form, whether furloughing one or most of their workforce, depending on their type of business and the sector that they're in. And crucially, the application process so far is going smoothly for most, and payments are already starting to be made just 6 days after the first applications went in. I don't know about you, Vicky, but for me, that's the first government IT success story that I've seen in quite a while. I'm now going to touch wood here just to make sure that that continues, but we have seen that working reasonably well. So I think we have to give credit where credit is due, but keep pushing the government to go further where we see more support may be required.
You did mention, actually, I heard you this morning on the Today program, the importance of grants and firms really not perhaps wanting to be over indebted. But of course, there's going to be an issue as to what happens when we come out of this. Do you think that the government has thought sufficiently, putting all the schemes together on the exit strategy and how it will support firms as we come out of this? Because obviously a lot will need to rebuild and perhaps start hiring people back again. We're hearing, and I'm hearing certainly, that in fact quite a lot of firms that have workers on the furlough scheme intend to just make them redundant, or a large percentage of them. So what extra support do you think might be needed in the next few months as we sort of ease out of this in a slow sort of way?
I think the first thing that businesses need is a form of forward guidance. Now, you and I used to talk about that phrase in the context of the Bank of England and interest rates, wanting to know when interest rates were steadily going to move up towards a new normal. But given that's unlikely to happen at any point in the near future, I'm going to appropriate the phrase forward guidance and use it to refer to how we gradually reopen the economy and how much information businesses have so that they can plan appropriately in order to get back up to full strength. I think the UK government has been very cautious in terms of giving businesses that forward guidance so far, because they don't want to undermine the lockdown and the public health benefits of the lockdown. And while that's completely understandable, they need to start giving some more clarity, I think, to firms on the timelines, on the mileposts that they have for that reopening. I'd expect we'll start to see that over the next few days. My team are immersed in meetings with a number of government departments about how businesses can work safely and what sorts of guidance firms need in order to be able to reopen successfully. But I do think, like you, it's going to be a relatively long process. And what that means is that the support schemes that have been put in place for business are also going to have to stick around for a while. There are too many people who say, if we reopen the economy by the end of June, then the support scheme should come to an end at the end of June. And that would absolutely be the wrong approach, because you would then see mass insolvencies and mass redundancies. We're going to have to find a way to gradually unwind these support schemes over time, in particular the furlough scheme. And that's going to require additional flexibility, I think, from the UK government.
Oh, well, indeed. And what we've been hearing as well from various businesses, and again, various sectors come and publicly say that they're going to need extra support for a period of time, is also an understanding that there's going to be costs involved in getting back to business. So even if they're going to be following those guidelines, it's not going to be easy for them, and also, of course, it will restrict trade to a significant extent. So when we talk about extra support, what type do you think? Are you talking about, from your point of view, extending the schemes for even longer because they've already been extended? That, of course, will cost a lot more. Is that the idea? And also thinking a little bit more about repayment of loans, perhaps a bit longer, or perhaps writing some off, being a little bit more adventurous
Yeah.
in this. Is that the type of stuff that you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to have to be a mixture of both. First of all, the schemes are going to have to be extended in their current form because not every business that has its staff on furlough is going to suddenly be able to magically reopen on the 1st of July in its entirety. So there would have to be a taper off of that scheme over a period of time. Huge numbers of businesses have got in touch with us to say, well, I'd like someone to be able to work 50% of the time and be on furlough 50% of the time, for example. Or we could look to the model they have in the Republic of Ireland, where there's a wage subsidy scheme in place and people are able to stay in work if it is safe to do so. So that kind of iteration, definitely going to have to see that happen. You mentioned the question of writing off some of these loans, and I can see from Martin Dupuy there's a question about precisely that that's arisen on the question and answer session. I think inevitably that some of the loans, both in the civil scheme and in the new bounce back loan scheme, inevitably some of those loans may have to be written off over time. And the rationale for doing that would be it's a price that you'd have to pay in order to preserve employment, preserve people's well-being, and actually then preserve their health as well, because the costs of unemployment, scarring, and ill health would probably be greater over the long run than the costs of writing off some of those loans. So I think we'll be talking about a number of these schemes, not just for a few months, but for a year or more to come in some way, shape, or form. They're just going to keep on changing.
Well, there's one question I would like to ask you, because obviously, as an economist, I'm a little bit worried about what will happen to productivity and growth in the long term. If these policies are not in place by the time we start reopening, do you think this is going to be a big issue about investment? Are companies going to be considerably more worried about committing anything for the longer term, or is it going to be mostly survival that everyone will be focusing on?
Well, I think that with these schemes in place, companies will be able to devote some of their attention to potential investments. The question I've got at the moment is, companies in Britain of all sizes have been sat on a reasonable amount of cash over recent years. You and I, in better times, we're always talking about how do we get them off of those cash piles and get them investing in their productivity, get them investing in their future profitability. Now the question is how much of those cash piles will still remain after this, because many companies, of course, have been having to raid those reserves in order to keep their operations going, in order to pay their people, etc. I think without government support, we would see a further collapse in business investment. And ultimately, given that this is a moment when we want to make significant changes to our economy, because you never want to waste a good crisis, what you need to do is make sure that investment is actually something companies want to do. So withdrawing the support too early would, I think, be fatal to that. So again, that is an important consideration.
But does that also mean that there have to be special tax measures put in place, possibly to encourage investment in the future? So is that sort of thing that you'd be lobbying for?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You would want to see incentives for business investment as part of the recovery plan. Those could take a number of different forms. They don't have to be the blunt instrument of low corporation tax rates, for example, or anything else, which haven't actually been a positive fillip to business investment over time. We think of things like widening the sorts of things that you're allowed to invest in as a business and claim investment allowances and investment relief. So why shouldn't firms be able to claim reliefs for and capitalize training, for example? Why shouldn't they be able to improve their premises in order to make them more sort of in keeping with the government's net zero target? There are all sorts of things that people could be allowed to do with the appropriate incentives. And my hope would be that that would get the construction industry going again. It would get the education and training industry going again, and so many other industries where that incentive to invest would bring additional domestic demand through.
Thank you. Perhaps we can now revert to you asking me a question about the economy.
Absolutely. One question, Vicky, that we have worried about is the government's infrastructure spending program. You mentioned that budget back on the 11th of March, which seems a million years ago to many of us now. But in that budget, Rishi Sunak committed to a very extensive program of public capital investment, something that people like you and I have been lobbying for a long time, because it sticks to the sides. The infrastructure that you get is still there 60 years later, adding value to the economy, and probably both of us were very pleased to see. Do you see a threat get to that investment now, given the huge amount of emergency spending that has been required? Are we about to commit a mistake like George Osborne did in 2010 when he hacked back the infrastructure budget, only to realize a few years later that he'd undermined the productive potential of the economy?
Well, the problem is that the easiest thing to cut is future supposed commitments to capital expenditure. And as you probably had noticed, even at the time of the budget, quite a lot of infrastructure spending was happening in the latter parts of this parliament. So huge temptation generally to cut that, because of course there's going to be a lot of pressure, given the experience that we just had, to fund the NHS properly, to put a sufficient amount of money into education, restarting schools properly. Universities are going to be in trouble, so they may need an awful lot more support, but also, social care, local councils, in all those areas, whether it's the police, the criminal justice system, all those that have been starved of resources in the past. I think the public will want to see those properly supported in the future. So there's going to be a tremendous push to do more on current spending. It's so easy to cut capital spending, as I said, and we saw that with Osborne. We probably saw it even before. Even if there hadn't been a change of government, we probably would have had similar reactions from Labour as well, because basically there was a need to get things back under control, but perhaps not as rapidly as we've seen, which caused huge harm to the economy. So I do worry that when they look at this again, of course, the markets are still prepared to lend quite a lot and quite cheaply to the UK, but there has to be a plan to get back to some sort of normality, even though that normality may mean a higher debt to GDP ratio for a very long period of time, which the markets will accept.
But I think we're agreeing here, Vicky, that it shouldn't be at the cost of making those investments in the future infrastructure that the UK needs, that we've got to proceed with some of that infrastructure, whether it's rail improvements, the energy grid, the broadband networks that we're all testing to destruction at the moment whilst working from home. That sort of investment has got to continue, doesn't it? Even as we try to proceed back to a new normal.
I agree entirely. It has a very big multiplier. I think it is going to be government spending that's going to sustain the economy for some time to come. In reality, incomes will have been reduced very significantly during this period of huge uncertainty. A lot of people losing jobs, and also even if they keep them, actually being paid a lot less. So there isn't going to be that money around. Something needs to give, and I'm afraid it's going to have to be government with extra incentives, of course, for businesses to start again. But even if we look at what was going on just before we got into this position, in the last quarter of 2019, where we had stagnant growth, which now looks good by comparison to what we're going to see now, it was government spending that kept it from falling. Otherwise, all other sectors of the economy were declining. So, and there is no other way of getting that money to be used in a productive way but spending it on infrastructure. And the regions need it hugely. And we're all worrying about this levelling up. The reality is that a number of regions will have been particularly badly hit. We talk about London, of course, but if you look at manufacturing centres all across the world, all across the UK, they have been affected by the reduction in demand across the world. And they are probably going to find it much harder to get back to any sort of normality. So if anything, the amount of money that you need to spend and the effort you need to make, whether it's local infrastructure or anything else, which actually leads to an increase in jobs, production, etc., is going to be much greater now than perhaps had been envisaged even at the time of the budget.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. And I think you've just answered David McDonald's question, which was, given the very low cost of money at the moment, is this not the time to invest in large capital projects? I think, David, the answer from both Vicky and myself is a definitive yes. I wanted to come, though, Vicky, to Tony Agarwal's question. Tony asked what policy suggestions you have and why for the UK government to grow the economy again. We've just talked about incentives for business investment. We've just talked about infrastructure. Are there other things that could form pillars of a UK government economic strategy here?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because, of course, everyone is concerned about what would happen to the green economy, any initiatives we had there, since they were supposed to be also leading to innovation, growth, and with it, of course, better productivity in the economy. I think there's quite a lot that can be done. in relation to encouraging firms that will depend quite significantly on government help, particularly large firms, and whether it's the car manufacturing sector, airlines, and so on, to also think of, as they come out of this, a greener future, a way of producing which actually is in line with climate change guidelines that we had before, and also targets. In other words, make it a sort of condition so that they do spend money in areas that perhaps will give us growth, and also a better growth, and don't spend it on buying back their shares or unproductive ways that we have seen quite a lot of before. So there could be an industrial strategy that is developed which focuses on this, but it requires a lot of hands-on government intervention for this to happen. So you get this extra help, particularly as we come out of this recession, but you get it on condition that we have the type of growth that we would all like to see in the future. And with it, I think also rethinking company law, making sure that we are moving towards a more sort of corporate responsible environment. That will be good for growth, but it does require very active intervention. And lots of firms probably will resent that.
Well, and you have a government which ideologically would not, in normal times, be supportive of that sort of intervention in the economy. But you have amongst the business population at the moment a receptiveness to the trade-off of, if you get government support, you should not be doing share buybacks or paying out enormous salaries, etc. So there seems to be more of a business consent for measures of constraint on some of our largest corporations than perhaps there has been in the past. But let me ask you about another area which could form part of this sort of recovery strategy, which is deregulation. Now, we've talked about deregulation a number of times over the years with minimal impact, I think, because everyone complains about the totality of regulation on businesses, but very often it's difficult to pinpoint and reduce the very specific elements of gold plating that so complicate lives of our business people. But what we've seen in this crisis is that a number of regulations have been paused or stopped entirely to enable the health system, the supply chain, etc., to respond. If that works and works well, should we be going back, or should we be making those changes permanent?
I think simplifying regulation is absolutely essential, and not having regulation in areas where we don't need it because we got used to having it and it just never disappears from the statute books for some reason. Then I think that's a very good way of doing it. But of course, these are exceptional times, and we need to get things quickly to the National Health Service or whatever. And we need to think which ones are actually important, which are not. But of course, if we're going to be trading internationally, and I'm pretty certain that some regulations have been eased in loads of different countries, but then they'll be thinking again the same as we will be thinking, which ones do we still need to keep? But we do need to have regulations that are accepted across and allow us to trade easily with the rest of the world. And of course, Europe still matters, and matters significantly. So we have to just watch it. But there are so many regulations that we have which are just internal, and where perhaps we can rethink. But of course, there is a worry with this. Some of the areas that we've been pushing, that includes, of course, the climate change one, for example, are concerned about plastics. We're now seeing that actually quite a large part of what the plastics production does is pretty good for us. So let's just make sure we do the right things there. But also, in terms of equality, what we've seen is that women are particularly affected right now by this slowdown. And of course, one of the regulations that was there, which said that companies had to provide their pay gaps, that the pay reviews, which are now required by legislation, have been postponed. So we don't need to do that for a while. So we might go backwards a little bit in some of the areas where we have seen some improvements. So we just have to watch that we don't revert to the types of habits that we had before, whereas we have made huge progress until now.
Thank you. You mentioned the balancing act in terms of regulation between making life simpler for businesses as we come out of this and needing to trade overseas, and sort of complying with the regulations necessary in order to do that effectively. We've had a couple of questions, one from C. Williams and one from Jeremy Canning, around the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the Brexit process and our ability to negotiate trade deals around the world. Do you see a result of what's been going on in recent months being a shortening of UK supply chains or changes in UK supply chains to make them more resilient, particularly because a number of businesses have found actually that sourcing things from faraway markets is making life more difficult from them, and in all likelihood, international trade will continue to face some disruption over the months ahead?
There has been a general trend. There's rethinking. But of course, it takes quite some time to unwind all the arrangements that have been made. And of course, in the meantime, there could be supply shortages, as we've seen. And when the car manufacturing sector starts again, it will be interesting to see there what types of shortages there may be. So everyone is rethinking this offshoring, onshoring, balancing act that they need to do. And of course, depending on bits of the world where there could be a crisis and you can't get your supplies in, and therefore you can't in fact produce the final product, is an issue. We don't want to just stop trade and become protectionist. I don't think it's going to be good for anybody, and it may be very, very difficult to onshore quite a lot of areas of production simply because we've lost the expertise. It's going to be very expensive, and it's actually costly to recreate it anyway. But there will be a certain amount of that, and Europe is thinking about that quite seriously as well. So we may be facing a very different type of environment on the Brexit front, and whether the transition period in particular may need to be extended. I mean, the truth is that logistically, some of the trade negotiation agreements we already have that we were going to be rolling over at the end of this year, we haven't actually been able to do with third countries. And they are in the middle of COVID crisis, so that may be difficult. And of course, Europe has other things to worry about too. But Europe itself is thinking quite seriously of changing competition policy, of supporting European champions in areas so that it isn't so dependent on external changes that may happen that might disrupt production. So we might find that it is actually a different Europe that we will have dealings with, and it's going to make it quite hard for us to be competitive in that environment. If Europe is slightly more protectionist, we may need to think differently, but it may just give us loads of extra challenges, I'm afraid, to deal with. So it's not as simple as, well, let's do a little bit more internally, but it's also what sort of barriers may we be facing in the future, which might in fact be much worse than what we envisage will be the case at the end of this transition period.
Yes, well, I mean, because there is, of course, the question of how the UK can be a continued champion of free trade. Mark Goldston has asked, the UK has always been a champion of free trade. How do we respond to increasing protectionism around the world? Now, obviously, as you say, if Europe is looking inward at what it needs to produce for the single market within the group of 27, that leaves us geographically very close by and with significant trade links. But perhaps much further away psychologically and economically than we may have been previously. But equally, are there domestic or other global supply chains that we should be tapping in that respect? Because obviously, we're going to have to build trade links where we can, and trade will flow where it can.
Well, yes, and that has been the aim, to try and do that. But of course, they're further away, and therefore, if we're going to have supply chains that are not directly with Europe, but from with others, then there is the extra cost involved, and of course the disruption can be even greater if something happens. And we've seen quite a lot of the former colonies, if you like, also being disrupted by the virus. So there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and I think it may have to depend sector by sector what types of supply chains we may need to develop in the future for greater security. But I would suspect that there will be a certain element of onshoring that does take place. But frankly, the closer one is geographically, and it just shows the importance of Europe, the easier it is to get the supplies. I mean, look what's happening now, all the food that's coming from Europe, which has hardly been disrupted, despite the sort of crisis that we've been going through.
And that taps into the question of resilience. I want to come on to a question from Rupert Johnston, Rupert's asked, what's your view on introducing a legislative or regulatory requirement to ensure that businesses put in place effective resilience and continuity strategies to protect themselves, their workforce, and the supply chain in future, brackets, from the next crisis, end brackets? I think that's a very good question from Rupert. Do businesses do enough actually to be resilient? You know, we can talk about this in the context of Brexit. We can talk about it in the context of the epidemic that we're facing right now. But there are lots of shocks out there, and our businesses have gotten leaner and leaner and less resilient over the decades. Do you see things going in the opposite direction now?
That's such an interesting question, because my concern has been that, which of course has a lot to do with unemployment, that in order to cover yourself for any future disruption, you're going to try and rely a lot less on people, who are of course the ones likely to be affected by any new pandemic, or maybe the W coming, in other words, having another wave. So there will be certainly, in order to get resilience into the system, an inclination to automate more, cut back on people, reduce the layers. And we saw that already in a sector which has been struggling with profit margins, such as the retail sector, where the expectation was anyway that this year we're going to see a reduction in the numbers of people working in the sector by something like 170,000, following a similar fall last year, et cetera, because basically people are being substituted by machines. That may well be one of the temptations of businesses to increase their resilience, to do precisely that. The second one is, for those who can, is to change the ways in which they work, not only in terms of automation, as I mentioned, but also have a lot more home working and different ways of getting access to the people using technology in a more productive way, still keeping people going, of course. The third,
the floor plate of the office may be very different in future as more and more people work from home.
Oh, well, absolutely. I worry for the commercial property sector. We'll still need all those offices, and I'll also worry about our pensions, frankly, in the sense that quite a lot of the areas that we were investing in, whether it was, you know, a big property companies or oil companies, of course, which are now suffering considerably. We just had some of the results come through, the first ones of big oil firms, which don't look good. So one will not need to reconfigure all this. But in terms of resilience, the last thing I would mention is insurance. We've seen the problems that firms have had with insurance companies, whether they were covered. The likelihood now is, because this pandemic has come and maybe we don't have to wait another 100 years until the next one comes, it's going to be much harder to get that type of insurance. In the future, it's going to be very, very pricey. So there needs to be some rethink, and I think that's where the government perhaps can step in and provide that type of emergency insurance platform that can exist in the future. And I think that will make such a big difference in terms of companies' willingness to invest in the future. So I worry about our long-term investment, innovation and productivity as a result, that we might end up with a much less competitive economy unless some of the structures are put in place.
Thanks, Vicky. You mentioned insurance there as one sector that has had its challenges in explaining some of the choices that it has made vis-a-vis policyholders, in particular many businesses who said they had business interruption insurance, et cetera, et cetera. It leads on nicely to a question from Stephen Huyton. Stephen's asked, governments around the world have thrown the rule book away in responding to this crisis. Financial markets and companies have yet to show the same out-of-the-box thinking. Financial markets in particular are responding in the traditional way, hitting companies hard who respond with empathy to their stakeholders. Is there not a danger that the good work of governments to keep the economy going is undermined by markets demanding companies take short-term measures to shore up short-term problems and thereby exacerbate the economic downturn? Vicky, do you have a concern there that actually everything that we've been lobbying for to get support in place for government could be undermined in some way by behavior of some sectors or some parts of the financial services sector?
Well, the interesting area is, what will shareholders do in the future? Because remember that some of those shareholders are our pension funds on whom we're going to be depending. So maybe one should think again about what their duties are, or maybe we should all get used to the fact that perhaps the returns aren't going to be as great as they were before, and we just have to move into that new territory, or something else can give. But in reality, if a firm behaves in a more sustainable way, if you like, in a more caring way, all the evidence suggests that they survive for longer and they do better in the longer term as well in terms of returns. So the business case needs to be made very clearly, and I think it needs to be made also by government, that they have different expectations, and those they support have to behave in a certain way, whether it's to do with executive pay, or whether it's to do with, dividend payments and so on. But also, of course, the culture of coming up with your returns with your results every quarter may need to change. So maybe there has to be a considerably the longer term view that's taken by both shareholders, but also government legislators, if you like, in terms of what they expect of companies. And I think that might change as well. I think the push for a different type of company, which is in the public interest, if you like, may increase quite significantly as a result of this. I think there will be both voter pressure, worker pressure to get to that, and I think we need to change the legislative environment so that this type of pressure that you were mentioning, like loads of people are worried about, doesn't really happen in the future. It's not as hard as it has been happening recently.
So one optimistic outcome from that then would be an outbreak of long-termism in UK business thinking, and indeed in the thinking of the individual shareholders at the very least, who make up a big chunk of the market. That'd be an interesting outcome, and interesting to see it prompted by an external shock in this sort of way. I wanted to mention other things that are affected by some of these shocks that we're seeing around the world. Andrew Dobson has raised a question, saying you've mentioned about the oil price and the average for 2020 being around $35 a barrel. What about sterling? We saw a sharp fall as we started lockdown. How do you think the value of the pound will change as we start to reduce restrictions? Obviously something that's been closely watched as it's bounced around before the coronavirus crisis and indeed over the last few weeks. Where do you see sterling going, Vicky?
Well.
I told you I was going to ask you to get your crystal ball out.
Yeah, I'm not a currency forecaster, but the UK, of course, has had yet another downgrade in its credit rating. So that affects supposedly the interest rates that it can borrow long term, but in reality it hasn't. So the market seems to have decided that the UK is okay, can borrow, and will get out of this somehow. And the way in which you look at exchange rate changes is very much sort of looking at the basics, which is, the difference in interest rates in different countries. And we have, of course, reduced our rates very significantly. And when we did in the time of the previous budget, or around that, sterling fell very significantly. But then, of course, we've seen interest rates come down everywhere, and monetary expansion happening all across the world in massive scale. So the US itself, with extra huge QE, quantitative easing has taken place. The Japanese only yesterday announcing that they will give unlimited support, unlimited. They didn't even say, we're going to do QE by that amount. It's unlimited. So which would keep their rates at zero or below. So if you just compare us with others, we are still in a position where, our rates don't look too similar to others, and the others have done, if anything, a bit more in terms of monetary expansion, and therefore sterling has managed to keep its level. That's basically what has been happening. So other countries, of course, that have seen falls in commodity prices, those that depend hugely on oil or others have been affected negatively, or other commodities. But the UK has retained it, and probably, unless there is any difference in interest rates in the future, some go seriously sort of negative, it's probably going to stay where it is. But if the others go negative, then we'll probably strengthen. There is faith, I think, that the UK can carry on borrowing and printing money, and therefore is considered to be quite a safe haven, strangely enough, despite everything.
Despite everything, indeed. Vicky, as we come towards the last few minutes, I wanted to come back to a couple of questions that have been asked by colleagues who are on the call with us today that actually talk about the return to normality. We've looked a little bit at impacts to date. We've looked a little bit towards the future, but there's some practical questions coming up right now. There's one from Mick Dunlop, for example, which I've been giving a lot of thought to in recent days myself, which says that Scotland has already come out and said that they may not follow the UK government's easing of restrictions. What impact do you feel this will have on recovery? Just to add to that, we've also heard the Welsh First Minister in literally the last 24 hours saying that Wales may take a different course as well. From businesses, we're hearing real concern that the four nations of the UK do four very different things, which increases confusion amongst businesses and the public and actually increase the costs of coming out of this. How important, how valuable is coordination across the UK market in order to aid recovery?
I think coordination is absolutely essential in my view, so that there is some certainty in terms of what can be done, what cannot be done. But I suspect that there could be some regional variations in places where there are very few cases, for example, you can do things slightly differently, and in places where the composition of the economy is such that you can do a lot more with serious social distancing, even if you open up, than you can in other places. You could do things slightly differently, but not too differently. And in some ways, other parts of the nation of the UK might learn from the experience of those. I'm not talking about anything major. I think it is contemplated in a number of countries in Europe. In fact, the opening up in places like Italy, which was pretty sort of drastic and draconian, and places like Spain, is that people can start traveling, doing various things and linking up with relatives, but within their region. So they have to stay in the region. Now, how easily you can enforce that is a different issue. You can do it all sorts of ways through altering the frequency of trains and not allowing commutes or whatever, and therefore stopping. But it's complicated. It requires quite a lot of surveillance. I've no idea whether the other sort of nations in the UK or countries in the UK can actually achieve that easily. But it's not sort of beyond the bounds of possibility that you could have some regional variations, especially in places where there are very few cases, for example, where you can perhaps ease up a bit.
I think businesses have said to us that variation because of public health considerations and a judgment that easing is possible is okay. I think what they're worried about is political variation between the nations, ultimately leading to very different courses and possibly to some ill effects. So we'll have to watch the space on that one and see what happens. One final question, Vicky, we were talking just a moment ago about some of the activities that may resume. We have a question from Jose Romanillos, who is asking how realistic is a prompt return to group activities, which is such a key part of the economy. He mentions football, restaurants, events, festivals, all of the happy stuff that people like to do, which of course has a very significant and positive impact on GDP. Just for our last question today, do you think it's realistic that we'll be seeing a return to some of these activities over the coming months?
I would just guess that those would be the last ones to open up. And we've seen that festivals are now being postponed for the following year, which were due to take place, say, in October. So I think there are assumptions already made that this is not going to be happening. And even in places where they're now allowing, or they have allowed, continue to allow, because like Sweden, events, they wouldn't let events happen with more than 15 people there. So I'm afraid that particular sector would have to wait for a little bit longer. We're just going to have to dance at home, basically, and jump up and down there. Are we hearing, though, this morning about gyms? It's got up rather early this morning. Various places, various gyms seem to think they can open because they're big and they can keep the social distancing. So we might see that some aspects of that leisure, although maybe they consider it to be health, business can do or can get back to normality of some sort faster than others. But overall, I think the sort of festival and fun sector will have to wait for longer.
So the fun will have to be had dancing over Zoom, as you say, Vicky. Two final very short questions from me. These are for one-word answers, if I may. Question number one, and this should be expressed as a percentage number, please. What do you think the hit to UK GDP will be this year?
All right. The forecasts are between the 10 and 13% drop. So
Okay.
it could be more.
Okay, and then final one, which is a yes or no answer. Do you think that the transition period for Brexit will be extended in light of the COVID-19 crisis?
I would say yes, but the majority of people I know say no.
Very well hedged. Ladies and gentlemen, like all good economists, Vicky Pryce has the full complex answer ready for us, even for that last question. Vicky, I want to thank you so much for answering questions from our public today, and also the good humored conversation we've been having about the state of the economy and the needs of business. We at the British Chambers of Commerce will continue hosting webinars together with local chambers of commerce all across the UK who are doing amazing work on behalf of their local business communities at this most difficult of times. I want to thank our partners Moneycorp for their support, both today and in all of the work that we do together in supporting and encouraging international trade. And finally, everyone, want to encourage you to stay safe, and if you can do so, continue doing business as much as possible. Because for people like Vicky and myself who are trying to help get the UK economy back on track, the best thing business people can do is be inventive and find new ways to do great things. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. See you again soon.